attack. And so we'll also talk about appleseedinfo.org, the Appleseed Project as well, and take your phone calls coming up in about 45 minutes. But I want to talk first at length to our guest because I've probably read, 15, 20 big books on the Revolutionary War itself, quite a few books on the pre-war. I read Alexander de Tocqueville's book that came out about 10 years after the war, where he went around the colonies, now the United States, and was just amazed by the ingenuity, the intelligence, the educational level of folks living in log cabins, just the most amazing people he'd ever seen. He'd been all over Europe. And then how we've turned into what we are now, how we get back what we were, this incredible heritage, and then go forward from there. So it's really great to have Sam Damewood on with us. Sam, it is wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. I appreciate you inviting me on your show today.
For folks that don't know who you are, a little bit more about yourself, and then, how you got involved in Appleseed, what it is briefly, and then we're going to get into what this country really is about.
Well, Alex, I'm really just an ordinary person here in America. I was born in the late 50s, grew up with all of the fine American values that we had in the 60s, was taught to be a decent human being by my parents, joined the military. I spent most of my adult life with them. When I retired, I came out into gunsmithing, and a couple of years ago, a friend of mine put me onto the Appleseed people. He said, "This is something you really need to get into." And I looked at them, checked them out. I went and participated in an Appleseed shoot, and I said, these people have something that I really need to be part of. They've got the message. They know where America's from. They have those values that we all appreciated and that we grew up hearing about when we were children. And that's how I got involved with Appleseed, and it just took off from there.
And you're an instructor with Appleseed now.
Yes.
Break it down for folks, what this country's really about and why the globalists want to remove our heritage. Let's break it down.
Well, I'm not really sure why the globalists want to remove it, but over the past 200 years, we've deviated a lot from the principles that we've read about from our founding fathers, and Appleseed just put me back on track. It just told me where I needed to go to get back with those values and those things that our country was founded on, our love for freedom. And I believe there are people in the world that just can't deal with freedom. Here in America, we're founded on freedom, and Appleseed's the best way I've seen to maintain it. So I stuck with it.
Briefly describe Appleseed, and then let's get into some of those great stories you were telling, many of which I was familiar with, but I love the way you were telling them. Let's spend some time on the spirit of the riflemen, 70-plus-year-old men fighting the redcoats. I mean, people need to hear that.
Sure. In Appleseed, we introduce to our shooters a lot of the history that went with Lexington and Concord and the background behind them, so that they can appreciate what it took for our founding fathers to break away from England. And in amongst the shooting instruction, we tell the story of what we call the three strikes, what started the Revolutionary War and how it got going. We offer very good shooting instruction in the process, but when people are listening to the history, it brings tears to their eyes, because the older people are familiar with it and the youngsters have never heard it. It's not taught in the schools today. We teach the nation's heritage as riflemen, how the people planned to take care of themselves. They were self-reliant in those days and looked out for each other. They just wanted freedom, and they planned for it, and they carried it out. And Appleseed brings back that heritage as a nation of riflemen to America and introduces people to the history of the founding and how we got going. And I guess we really should start with back at Lexington and Concord, like we like to teach it in Appleseed. On the 18th of April of 1775, General Gage was the British commander in Boston. And the cities of Boston and New York had been occupied by the British military for almost 10 years at that point, in retaliation for actions that we'd taken against the First Stamp Act in 1763. The people rebelled against it. They felt that they were being unfairly taxed for a purpose that they didn't care for. They weren't consulted in it. And Parliament had never before tried to control the colony or tax them. With the mounting debt that big government will always bring, the Parliament was in huge debt from the French-American War. In the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, as we call it, and they wanted to recoup that, so they passed the Stamp Act and the Revenue Act to try and raise money to pay that off. The colonies objected. They objected so strongly that the British sent in over 10,000 troops to occupy the country, and when we refused to pay to quarter those troops, they sent in more, occupied New York specifically to punish them. Along with those taxes, they started passing what were known as writs of assistance, which were general search warrants that allowed the British to search anywhere they wanted for contraband that had been smuggled in violation of those taxes. And Americans were pretty creative as smugglers in those days, as some of them still are, and the British just couldn't keep up with it in any way, shape, or form. As the British government became more and more oppressive to America, the colonists took action to protect themselves. And they formed committees of correspondence to pass information back and forth between the colonies so that everyone could keep abreast of the latest news, what oppressions and evils were being done. One of the people that we hear a lot about, Paul Revere, was primarily a messenger for the Committee of Correspondence of Massachusetts Colony. And he was widely respected and known to people all over the nation because he carried the messages back and forth. He made a series of journeys south carrying news from the Committees of Correspondence. As the oppression became more and more intolerable, the people knew that they were going to have issues. The British had taken the government of Massachusetts Colony and thrown it out. They said, you no longer have the right to govern yourself. We'll appoint the courts. We'll appoint the representatives. We'll tell you everything to do. The people of Massachusetts were very brilliant. They ignored the British. When the British tried to have a court sit, people didn't come for jury duty. When the British tried to have an assembly and vote on things, get things done, people ignored what they said and did. They held their own town meetings and continued to rule themselves. And the British were highly intolerant of that. And as things came to a head in late 1774, the British started to become more and more aggressive in trying to control the colony.
Now, let's stop there. We're going to break in a moment and come back and go through this. But as you list what you're listing that was later put in the Declaration of Independence, they've now announced Northcom, 20,000 troops for the streets of America, for civil insurrection, that the governors will serve at the pleasure of the president as dual-hatted military officers, same thing the British did. They've created all these new courts, family courts, federal bureaucracies, regional courts that aren't even real courts, they're tribunals. All the same forms of tyranny are now being used. The blank FISA warrants, that's not even good enough for them. Now they just don't have warrants. They're using the Patriot Act in non-terror-related cases. So we see literally a mirror image and quartering of troops. That also makes troops in the streets, troops at checkpoints, at street corners. Now we're hearing this is happening. And I had a judge advocate colonel on last week who's a Republican saying this is horrible. It's all over the news that what we're hearing is totally illegal. So we see a dovetailing here with what our founders went through and what we're going through. And the good news here is they were occupied, as you say, for more than a decade before they finally physically fought back. So, folks, this is going to be a long, hard fight, and that's separate from Appleseed and the rest of it. The point is that it was the publishers. Many of the founding fathers were publishers, and they finally tried to stop them publishing their newspapers.